The sky didn't just go dark, it vanished, eaten alive by a monstrous wall of grey that rumbled like the end of days. No warning, no mercy, just wind and dirt clawing at the bones of the earth. Alone on a failing patch of prairie, Matilda Granger clutched the frame of her crooked porch as the storm swallowed the horizon whole. She wasn't expecting company, especially not a knock urgent, desperate splintering the silence. She opened the door to find them, men carved from dust and desperation, cowboys dragged in by the wrath of the plains, lost, hungry, half broken by a world that had already moved on without them. She barely had enough to feed herself, but Matilda scraped together what she could. She figured they'd vanish with the storm. Instead, 2 days later, a shadow fell across her fields, not a cloud this time, but a slow procession of riders on horseback, silent and somber, bringing with them a debt no wind could erase. That night, the air groaned with something more than wind, something ancient and angry dragging itself across the wasteland. Matilda stood on her porch, one hand gripping the warped beam for balance, skirts snapping like sails around her legs. That sound, she knew it too well. The old ones called it a death cry, the voice of a dust storm so fierce it could strip your skin and hope all in one breath. The sky was gone. The sun, once a bright copper coin above her fields, was buried behind a suffocating wave of grey. Her livestock moaned low and mournful in the barn. She glanced skyward, whispered a prayer she no longer fully believed in, and pulled her worn shawl tight. She had no husband anymore, no friends either. Just her and the land, and even the land was starting to push back. She was about to turn in when something cut through the wind. A voice, not woo. Shouts, weak but human. Figures appeared, stumbling out of the storm like ghosts. 3 of them, broad hats, scarves tied high across their faces, clothes stiff with grit. They didn't look like robbers or killers. They looked like men hanging by threads. The first to reach her steps was built like an old oak tree, solid but clearly bent by time or pain. His limp told part of his story. His dust-covered face told the rest. "Ma'am," he rasped, tipping his hat with cracked fingers. "Ain't here for trouble, just looking for a roof. Just for a bit." Matilda hesitated. Her gut screamed to bolt the door. She had a rifle just inside, but 3 strangers in a bad mood could finish what the storm had started. Still, something in the man's eyes gave her pause. They weren't hollow, just tired. She nodded once and stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled like old firewood and tougher memories. The men kicked the dust off their boots, reverent as if they were in church. Matilda moved into the tiny kitchen, muscle memory guiding her hands. A bit of cornmeal, a scrap of bacon grease she worked with what little was left. The coffee she brewed was so thin it looked like rainwater, but it was warm. 2 of the men muttered grateful words as they sank into chairs, hunched over like the wind had beaten them hollow. The 3rd man stayed quiet. Tall, a jagged scar ran from his brow to his jawline. His coat was more patch than fabric, boots chewed down to leather ghosts, yet he stood still and sharp like a blade propped against the wall. He didn't eat until she nodded. Then he broke the bread with slow, measured care. They ate in near silence, the storm rattling the windows and dust hissing through the seams like a living thing. When the food was gone, the talkers bedded down near the fire with quiet groans. The scarred one remained standing, gaze lost in the flames. Matilda watched him, uneasy. Then, without a word, she fetched an old blanket and laid it on the table. "For you," she said, voice hushed. He barely nodded, but when she turned away, she heard the faint rustle of fabric. That night, as the storm howled like a dying beast, Matilda lay awake in her narrow bed. Her house, usually so still, now held strangers and stories she didn't yet know, and in her bones, she felt it something had changed. Something had shifted in the dust. When morning finally dragged its red haze across the horizon, the storm had gone, but it had left scars. Dust dunes lined the yard like small graves. The sky was pale and bruised. Inside, Matilda stirred from fractured sleep, the scent of sweat and storm still hanging in the air. The 2 cowboys were already gone, their blankets folded neatly by the hearth. A small stack of coins shimmered beside them. Thanks, maybe, or apology. Either way, it felt foreign in her world. Only 1 man remained. He stood by the window, framed by weak sunlight, hat low, jaw clenched. One hand twitched at his side as though bracing for something bad. Matilda cleared her throat. "Coffee's cold, but it's there if you want it." They didn't speak again that night, but something shifted. Not loud, not flashy, just real. tangible as the dust still pressed into every crevice of the old house. Morning broke colder than usual, the kind of cold that slaps the soul and leaves it stunned. Wind clawed across the barren yard, whistling through splintered windows. The sky, too bright and too hollow, made the land feel like a forgotten corner of the world. Mabel rose, not out of hope, but habit. The land still needed tending, even if it had nothing left to offer. She found Riker already out there. He was tightening a splintered fence, each movement deliberate, like he was holding the place together with his bare hands. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but his presence stood like a rock in a river, anchoring her against the pull of despair. They worked side by side. The work wasn't much, but it kept the silence bearable. Glances passed between them, small nods, brief eye contact that said everything and nothing. Then, at noon, Riker saddled his horse. Mabel watched from the porch, something twisting sharp in her chest. She hadn't asked him to stay. He hadn't said he would. He was a man used to being alone, shaped by distance and dust. He adjusted the reins, checked the stirrups, and swung up onto his horse like it was part of him. For a second, she thought he'd ride off without a word, just disappear into the grey like a myth. But he paused at the edge of the yard, turned his head, and tipped his hat. Then he rode on. She stood there long after the dust swallowed him. The house didn't just feel empty, it felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped out the quiet and left behind only echo. He hadn't filled the space with noise or presence, but somehow he'd made the silence feel less sharp. The next day crawled like grief. Mabel did what she always did, fixed what was salvageable, let the rest rot. Tried not to imagine things. Hope, after all, was dangerous out here. It sprouted easy and died quicker than a blink. By evening, she ate thin stew at the kitchen table, facing the empty chair across from her like it might speak. She told herself it was better this way, cleaner. She was rinsing dishes when she heard it distant, deep, steady, not wind, not thunder. Her breath hitched. The plate slipped from her hands and cracked in the sink. She ran to the porch, heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped animal. Dust rose on the road like smoke, and then figures. Riders. Dozens of them. Moving slow but sure, stretching across the horizon like the past coming back to claim her. Panic surged in her gut. Was this trouble? Had Riker led danger to her doorstep? She gripped the railing so hard her fingers ached. Then she saw them. Dust-covered men, worn hats pulled low, horses lean and tired but pushing forward. Not raiders, not thieves, men with purpose. And at the front, Riker, he rode like someone with intention now, not like a drifter, not like a ghost. Behind him, their saddles were piled high, bundles of cloth, barrels, crates, sacks slung thick with supplies. It wasn't a raid, it was a return. She pressed a hand to her mouth, knees threatening to fold. They stopped near the porch, every man tipping his hat. Riker dismounted with slow care and approached the steps. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just dropped a heavy burlap sack at her feet. Flour, by the smell. Then, finally, his voice, "Storm took from you. We figured it was time to give some back." The rest followed his lead. In quiet rhythm, they began unloading supplies tools, grain, food, lumber. No one asked for thanks. No one expected a thing. Mabel stood still as the ground shook under the weight of what she was seeing. Kindness, given freely, returned with interest. No contract, no strings, just human decency wearing a coat of dust. The wind blew, but it no longer carried dread. It carried promise. The farm burst with sound. Hammers thudded against wood, shovels scraped the dirt. Laughter cracked through the air like lightning breaking a drought. The men moved like they belonged not to her, but with her. They fixed fences, repaired the barn, even patched the roof where the stars used to peek through. Not one demanded explanation, not one made her feel small. Riker moved through them like gravity, not loud, not dominant, just undeniable, a quiet kind of authority. Mabel worked alongside them, heart tangled in awe and disbelief. She fed them from the last of her stores. When that ran dry, the men filled the gap beans, rice, even salted pork from deep in their packs. Around a fire near the barn, they ate, the air warming with the slow return of something once lost. But not everyone watched with kindness. From the hills beyond, shadows lingered. Curtains twitched in distant windows. Eyes narrowed from neighboring farms. A woman alone was supposed to suffer, not host an army of dusty saints. Still, Mabel didn't care. Not anymore. That night, Under a sky punched full of stars, Riker came to her porch again. The repairs were done. The men were packing to leave at dawn. The wind carried the scent of earth, the promise of something still growing. "You saved us," he said, rough and soft. "I just did what was right," she murmured, hugging her shawl tighter. "Plenty folks turned us away. You didn't." His words hit hard. Truths always did. Mabel looked away, blinking fast. She wasn't used to being seen. "The town won't like this," she warned. "They'll say I'm crazy, or worse." Riker's lips twitched almost a smile. Town's been wrong before. And in that, he offered her not protection, not a promise, just truth, shared and solid. He was still a stranger, but one who understood what it meant to stand alone and not fall. The riders stayed one final night. At first light, they packed up, saddled horses, said their quiet goodbyes. A few offered thanks, most just nodded. Riker lingered. She stepped off the porch, breath misting in the morning chill. "Will you come back?" she asked, the words tumbling out without permission. For a long beat, he said nothing. Then he nodded, slow, sure, when the time's right. And then he rode off, disappearing like he'd arrived into the rising sun and the long open stretch of nowhere. Mabel watched until he was only shadow. The land still whispered, the dust still clung, but something had shifted, something real, something like hope, and it had taken root in her bones. The days that followed felt sharper, like the air had changed its texture. She patched the fences, planted seeds, swept the floor with a lighter touch. For once, the future didn't feel like something she had to endure, it felt like something she could shape. But hope had its price. It came first in the form of wheels to creaking wagon and the shrill whinny of a horse too well groomed for this land. Mabel knew before she even saw her. Mrs. Hargrove, the preacher's wife, dressed in judgment and lace. Mabel wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out to meet her. "Good morning, Mabel," the woman said, syrup sweet. "Morning," Mabel replied, "careful." Mrs. Hargrove's gaze swept over the new wood, the stacked supplies, the tightened fences. Her smile thinned. "Quite the blessing you've had, dear." "Suppose it is," Mabel said, quiet. "We were praying for you," the woman added, "though some wondered if you hadn't turned from the Lord, accepting aid from strange men and all." And beneath her voice, wrapped in silk, was the blade. The preacher's wife delivered her righteousness like a slap. Mabel's shoulders stiffened. She knew this game how virtue was a tool around here, polished and passed around only when it made folks look good. Her decision to show mercy, to open her door and not let men die in the dirt, had turned her into a rumor with a pulse. "I did what was right," Mabel said calmly, her voice flat as old iron. Mrs. Hargrove's mouth twitched into a smirk. "Sometimes, dear, appearances matter just as much as intentions. Surely you understand that." Mabel smiled, then sharp, unsweetened. "Seems to me God's got better eyesight than this town." For a blink, something flickered in the woman's eyes. Anger, uncertainty, whatever it was, she clutched her skirts like they might shield her from judgment and climbed back onto her prim little wagon. With a snap of the reins that screamed fury more than faith, she was gone. Mabel stood there, the porch beneath her feet suddenly heavier. This wasn't over. In the days that followed, small cruelties grew like weeds. At the store, Mr. Whitlow weighed her flour twice, charged her extra. The blacksmith, once friendly, wouldn't even nod her way. Children who used to wave now darted behind their mothers' skirts. She bore it all in silence. Mabel Granger had weathered worse storms, but at night, in the narrow bed where grief still curled like a dog at her feet, the loneliness sharpened. She thought of Riker more than she admitted his hand steady on broken timber, the quiet way he listened without needing to fix her. He had said he'd return. But promises, once they rode off into the horizon, had a way of getting buried beneath the dust. One evening, as the sunset painted the sky in bleeding orange and dying blue, Mabel stood at the edge of her fields. Dry grass waved like surrendering arms. A wagon passed on the distant road. She recognized Mrs. Hargrove again, seated with a cluster of townfolk, like they were heading to a sermon about sin and salt. They didn't look at her, didn't wave, didn't even blink. Mabel raised her chin. Let them whisper, let them brand her soft for caring. She wasn't going to carve herself into something cruel just to make them feel comfortable. The storms had taken enough, maybe it was time they took her fear too. As she turned to head inside, she thought she heard hooves. She stopped, heart jerking in her chest. But there was nothing. Just fields, just the waiting. The days blurred, stitched together by chores and silence, yet each dusk Mabel found herself on the porch, eyes tracking the far edge of the land, waiting, hoping. And then one night he came back. There was no thunder, no cry, just a silhouette walking a weary horse through the dusk. The red light of the setting sun lit him like a ghost walking home. Riker! The dust clung to him like it was born there, his hat low, his shoulders heavy. But she knew him. Her heart jumped, traitorous and wild, as she moved down the steps, her dress tangling in the wind. She wanted to ask why it took so long. Wanted to run to him and hit him and hold him. But when he stopped, just a few feet away, she saw it. The shadows carved under his eyes, the weight in his stance. He hadn't just been traveling, he'd been fighting something. Riker dismounted slowly. One hand held the reins. The other hovered like he wasn't sure whether to reach for her or turn around. "You came back," she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded, holding his hat against his chest. For a while, they just stood there. Then he spoke. "Trouble's been tracking me," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, rougher. "Thought you ought to know." Mabel's brow knit. "What kind of trouble?" He looked toward the horizon where the sun bled into the dirt. "Back in Hollow Creek," he said slowly. "They pinned a crime on me. Wasn't mine." He didn't go into detail, didn't plead. He just said it, plain and hard. "I ran. Wasn't going to get a fair shake. Town needed someone to blame, and I was standing in the wrong spot." She searched his face, read the history written in lines and scars. He didn't look scared, just tired. "Do you regret it?" she asked. His jaw worked once. Number only regret leaving behind folks that didn't deserve it. His words hung between them like smoke. She thought of her own exile, how the town had turned cold after her husband's death, how the hands that once brought casseroles and condolences now reached for stones. "You ain't the only one blamed for surviving," she said softly. Riker looked at her then, and in his ice raw, pale, wounded something flickered. "I can go," he said. No bitterness, no challenge, just a choice offered something no one had ever given him. Mabel stepped forward, close enough to smell the dust and leather and sorrow on him. His hands tightened on the reins like he was bracing for the blow. "No," she said. Just one word, but it was everything. He didn't smile, but something in him loosened, like the noose around his neck had slackened just a bit. She touched his sleeve. The rough fabric was warm from the sun. "You're not the only one with ghosts," she murmured. The wind stirred around them, full of old promises and the scent of dry earth. For the first time in years, Mabel felt like she wasn't just holding on, she was choosing. And that night, she chose him. 2 days later, Trouble rolled in on horseback. She'd been working the soil, coaxing life out of dust. Riker was fixing a broken wheel. The quiet was too thick, the kind of silence that comes before a scream. 5 riders crested the rise, their faces hard as stone. She knew them. Mr. Whitlow, the storekeeper, Reverend Hargrove, and 3 other landowners who used to toast her husband, then turned their backs the moment he was buried. They stopped in a line by the porch. Riker stepped beside her, quiet but unmovable. "Morning, Mabel," the Reverend said, removing his hat but not his judgment. "Morning," she replied, jaw set. "We've come to talk," he said. "There's concerns." Mr. Whitlow didn't wait. "You're harboring a wanted man. Whole town knows it." She felt Riker tense, but he said nothing. She stepped forward. "I helped a man who needed help," she said. "Same as I would have helped you." "It's not charity," the Reverend said. "It's about safety, appearances." She almost laughed. "Safety? Where was that when my roof leaked through 2 winters? Where was it when my husband died and none of you crossed the road?" They squirmed in their saddles. "You want me to send him away?" she asked. Murmurs of agreement. "It's for your own good," Whitlow said. "For the town." She laughed, Vena brittle, bitter sound. "For my good?" she snapped. "This town's done me no favors." "You have a chance to come back into the fold," the Reverend said. Mabel turned, looked at the land, at the repaired barn, the green shoots, proof of life. Then back at them. "I have a family now," she said. "It might not look like yours, but it's mine." The Reverend's mouth twisted. "You'll regret this." Her smile was calm this time. "Then let me." The men turned and rode off. Riker said nothing, not at first. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. Mabel looked at him, her heart pounded. "Neither did you," she said, "when you stayed, when you came back." For a moment, he just looked at her. Then slowly, he reached up, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was soft, but it shook her to her core. They stood in the wind, two broken pieces daring to fit together. The warning came at twilight. A boy barefoot, dust-streaked, not more than 12 rode in fast on a mule. "They're coming," he panted, "with ropes." And then he was gone. Mabel froze. She didn't have to ask who they were. Riker stepped beside her, jaw tight. "How many?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Enough." He moved fast, saddling his horse, loading a rifle. He didn't tell her to run, didn't tell her to hide. He just stood ready, like protecting her was the only answer he'd ever known. She tried to help, but her hands trembled. This was her land, her hope, her stand, and they were coming to crush it. She turned to him, her voice breaking. "You should go." Riker tightened the straps, looked at her with that steady, unflinching gaze. "I ain't running," he muttered, his voice low and ragged. Mabel's throat tightened. "I don't want you getting hurt, not because of me," she whispered, barely able to push the words out. Riker's jaw clenched. He took a step close enough for her to feel the heat rising off his skin, close enough for her to forget the fear. "Been hurt before," he said, eyes fixed on hers. "Not about to let them do it to you." Before she could reply, the sound hit the thudding gallop of hooves cutting into the twilight. Lanterns bobbed like angry fireflies. Over a dozen riders crested the hill, their faces lit with the savage righteousness of men who thought justice wore a noose. Mabel stood firm on the porch, and Riker stood beside her. His hand hovered over the rifle strapped at his hip, but it stayed down. The mob stopped just short of the porch, forming a crooked wall of flesh and fury. At the front, Reverend Hargrove sat high in the saddle, a coiled rope dangling casually from one hand, like a snake he meant to throw. "You were warned, Mabel," he called. "Hand him over, and we'll deal with this clean. You can go back to your life." Silence followed. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. Mabel stepped forward, shoulders squared. "I am living my life," she said, voice slicing across the field like a blade. Hargrove's expression twisted. "Don't be a fool, girl." Riker's fingers brushed hers, just a whisper of touch, but enough to ground her. "You'll have to go through me," he said. Quiet, clear, deadly. The words landed like thunder. The mob faltered. This wasn't what they came for. They expected shame, fear, not this. Mr. Whitlow shifted in his saddle. One of the younger ranch hands turned his horse slightly, already preparing his excuse to leave. Courage, it seemed, was hard to borrow. "You're making a mistake," Hargrove growled, the rope now slack in his hand. Mabel and Riker said nothing. They didn't have to. And just like that, the line broke. Men peeled off one by one, muttering oaths and kicking dust. None crossed the porch, none met their eyes. In minutes, they were gone. Only the Reverend remained. He looked at Thamat, the woman who refused to kneel, at the man who stood in the path of fire, and, in that moment, he looked smaller than she'd ever seen him. He turned his horse without another word and vanished into the dark. Mabel sagged slightly, the adrenaline draining from her bones. Riker caught her elbow gently. "You all right?" he asked. She looked at him, really looked at him. And in that moment, Mabel Granger believed something she hadn't in years. She wasn't alone anymore, and never would be again. The days that followed weren't wrapped in miracles. The dust still hung in the sky like a veil. The land remained cracked and stubborn. The townsfolk still turned away when she walked into the store. But something inside had shifted. She would return home each evening to find Riker fixing a busted hinge, cleaning an old tool, or carving something useless but beautiful on the porch steps. The house no longer felt like a memory. It felt like the first page of something unwritten. They never spoke about that night. They didn't need to. That kind of trust didn't come from words, it came from silence held together by truth. It was in the way his hand would find hers when they crossed a fence line. In the way she poured 2 mugs of coffee in the morning without asking. Spring arrived shyly, like a beaten dog testing the edge of the porch. The seeds Mabel had nearly given up on pushed through the soil-fragile, persistent green, life clawing back into the world. One evening, with the sun melting behind the hills, Riker set his saddle aside and joined her at the porch rail. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the stars blink awake one by one. Then he cleared his throat. "I ain't good with words," he said gruffly. She smiled gently. "I'd noticed." He shifted, suddenly more nervous than he had been facing a mob. "But if you'd have me," he said, eyes on the horizon, "I'd stay, not just for the work, not just till the weather turns." Her heart squeezed. She turned to him fully. "You're already home," she said. He just looked at her as if memorizing every line of her face, then reached out and took her hand slow. "Sure." No grand speeches. Just a choice. A quiet vow. Later, they sat by the fire, their shoulders brushed, their silence held steady, and Mabel, for the first time in years, let herself dream. Not of perfect days. There would still be dry seasons, harsh winds, cold shoulders in town. But there would also be mornings where he handed her coffee with that crooked little glance. Evenings where she leaned against his side, watching a sky big enough to swallow every old wound. It was a life. A raw, stubborn, beautiful life. As the fire popped and the wind whispered outside, Mabel closed her eyes and let the warmth wrap around her like a promise. The dust would always cling, the scars would always mark the past. But something stronger had taken root. Hope. And this time it had no intention of leaving. Sometimes the deepest kind of love isn't loud. It's built slow in the ruins, in the grit, in the quiet daily choice to stay. If this story stirred something in you, share it. Tell me what part hit home. And if you want more tales about courage, about redemption, about finding light in the middle of the storm, subscribe. Thank you for listening.